Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for Business Impact in a Changing World. My name is Jazmyn Becker, and I'm an MBA 2 at the University of Michigan Ross School of Business. And I'm so excited to be joined today for an engaging conversation with Dean Scott DeRue and Deloitte Consulting CEO, Dan Helfrich. And this conversation today is for you, for the over 500 of you who are tuned in. So we will be using interactive polls, some of the questions you submitted in advance, as well as a live Q&A feature. So to get started, again, Scott and Dan, thank you for joining us. And I would love to just start with a bit more about your history with your current organizations and what values drive how you lead in this changing world.
Well, Jazmyn, I can start. It's great to be with Team Michigan. I am joining you from just outside of Washington, D.C. in McLean, Virginia, where I am here with my 4 teenagers and my wife, Christy, which is quite a party. We're also fostering dogs right now. So there's somewhere between 2 and 7 dogs running around the house at any point in time. You asked for a quick history. I was an MBA actually from Georgetown University. I got 2 degrees from Georgetown, joined Deloitte straight out of Georgetown. And like many people who go into the consulting field, assumed that I would be there for 3 years and go do something great in the world. And 3 years has turned into 20 something. And I've been fortunate to do a ton of different things inside Deloitte. I started in the Cleveland office. And I know we have a good Northeast Ohio contingent in the Michigan crew, including the Bucilli family, who has a strong affinity to Deloitte. And then I've spent the majority of my time outside DC, including running our government business. And then 18 months ago, I got tapped on the shoulder to ask if I would become the CEO of the business. And it's been 18 months that at times has felt like 18 years, to be honest. And then to answer your last question, how have I led? I would tell you, I hope I've led the same way I led before the pandemic and before social justice became a front page headline. And I hope I led with integrity, with humility. And I think perhaps most importantly right now, with transparency to all the many stakeholders who, and livelihoods that I have responsibility for.
Thank you. How about you, Scott?
Yeah, no, Jazmyn, I appreciate it. And Dan, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's real privilege and pleasure. Short history, I actually started my career in a firm that Deloitte now owns, Monitor Deloitte, and the strategy practice there. So for me, this is like a full circle experience in many ways. But after a wonderful 5-ish years there, decided I love business and I love education. And if you put those 2 things together, the only thing you want to be in life is a business school professor. And so that was the route that I charted for myself, and arrived here at the University of Michigan back, almost 14 years ago now. And it's been an amazing journey. And Jazmyn, to your question around how we lead in these times, like Dan, I hope I am leading in ways that are consistent with how we led pre-pandemic. And if I think about what hasn't changed as a result of the last 8 months and everything that's happened, the pandemic, and everything that's happened around the globe, most recently with the elections here in the U.S., is the things that haven't changed is our commitment to our mission, our values, putting our people first, focusing on our academic mission, an unwavering commitment to the student experience. Those are things that are fundamental to who we are in our DNA. And so no matter what's going on in the world around us, those are those values and that sense of mission and commitment to our student experience, that is the North Star that guides everything we do. And, whether it's in Deloitte or whether it's here at the University of Michigan and the Ross School, if we lead with those values, then, really good things happen and we're able to deliver on our mission.
Yeah, thank you. And I know both of you kind of touched on this briefly, but the pandemic. So let's get started with that first question. How do you think the pandemic has impacted Deloitte, the consulting industry, and higher education? So Dan, would love to hear from you first, and then Scott.
I would say it's impacted us and our profession profoundly, but that profoundly isn't all negative. And so I'm going to start with the positive. What I've been pushing for and what I believe our profession has needed for some time is an impetus to change the way that we work, to be much more experience-based, much more virtual, and to change the rhythm of vision you have in your head of a consultant who's on an airplane and in a hotel room most of the time of their life. And the reason I've always felt like we needed to change that is because A, I've been confident we can do the work or lots of the work virtually. B, from a well-being standpoint, I think breaking up the rhythm of travel and the rhythm of work is more sustainable long-term. And then C, we're a big challenge as it relates to climate and the amount of carbon that we as a profession, consume is a challenge. And so what the pandemic has taught us, because we as a firm, we've been wildly successful in this moment. We transitioned from having, probably 15% of our workforce working from home to 94% of our workforce working from home in a matter of a couple weeks. And we've had no quality issues at all. And so more people have pressed the I believe button as to the type of change we could make in the way that we work than could have happened before the pandemic. Now, I start with the positive. Have there been challenges? There are immense challenges. And the biggest challenges, frankly, are about the lives and well-being of our people every day as they deal with incalculable stress. And that stress is partially professional stress, but lots of it is stress from economic uncertainty, political uncertainty, health uncertainty. And Scott talked about trying to have the ultimate student experience. Our culture is about trying to have the number one talent experience for all our people. And that's harder to do during this pandemic than ever before.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Scott, for you, how has the pandemic, impacted higher education?
Profoundly. I'm not even sure I have the words to fully describe the range of impacts. But I mean, if you think about it, there's actually a lot of similarities between the Deloitte experience and the higher education or business education experience. At its core, we're both service providers, right? Dan and his team are providing consulting services. We're providing education in all of its different flavors and forms. And like Dan with Deloitte, there are some things that have changed that have been positives, and there's other things that are real challenges that we continue to figure out. The first most obvious thing that's changed is how we design and deliver our education. Going into, if I go back to March 12th, we basically shut down the university for 2 days and migrated 46,000 students from residential education to remote education, right? That was certainly not easy. And then coming back for the fall, it was quite different, because for the Ross School, we had 50% of our courses online, all remote, and 50% of them hybrid, where you've got some students remote, some students in the classroom. That required new technology, new training and development for faculty, new course designs. And so a lot of change and disruption. And so the obvious part of that change is figuring out how we do what we used to do all in person, now in these hybrid or virtual formats. The less obvious, but possibly more impactful in a positive way, is beginning to reimagine what is possible from an education perspective now that we are distributed and in these hybrid formats. So it's not just about doing what we used to do in a virtual or hybrid format, but also rethinking and reimagining what is possible given the technologies and given the hybrid or virtual designs. And so there's been new ways of designing education that I think will actually stick beyond the pandemic, knock on wood, whenever that may end, hopefully sooner rather than later. The other thing that's really changed for us is how we connect, how we engage, how we create a sense of community and bring our culture to life, whether that's for our students, our faculty, our staff, our alumni. Like Deloitte, we're a very collaborative community. And so to bring that culture and sense of community together when we have physical distance around the globe, we've had to really rethink how we do that in terms of engagement and connection and a sense of togetherness. And I think we're still figuring that out. And so that's one of the challenges, that whether you're in education, consulting, how you create that sense of community and connectedness, whether it's with your employees, with your clients, with your students. It's so vital to what we do. And so that has dramatically changed.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I appreciate you guys sharing that insight on just culture and some of the silver linings you've been able to find during this time. So now we turn to this community with our first poll question focused on challenges and opportunities. So you'll see here a poll that will pop up, and we'll do these throughout the conversation today. What would be most important to you in accepting a position in the consulting industry? Leave that open for a couple of seconds.
Scott, what's your prediction about which is going to be the most highly voted?
Well, I don't want to skew the responses as they come in.
Chicken.
But
I'm going to guess that the first one will be the most selected answer.
So I would go with first or second. And I can tell you that when I was in a position of looking for a job in consulting, the first one was my answer. But in hindsight, the thing that made the biggest difference for me in consulting was actually number 3.
Okay.
And I assume that is both access to leaders within the consulting firm and with clients, which I think is one of the cool things about the profession.
Yeah.
Agreed. We'll take a look there, and nice predictions, team. So yes, ability to work on new different clients and or projects. So Dan, would just love some of your reflections on the poll results there as you see those kind of play out.
Yeah, look, I believe that any management consulting firm worth its salt provides people an experience that's like pressing fast forward on your development. And so you come join us and you join us for 2 years. I want to give you 4 years of professional development. You come here for 4 years. I want you to leave, if you leave, with 8 years of development. And I think that actually comes from the intersection of number 1 and number 3 on this list. It does come from variety because you get exposed to a broader set of topics, a broader set of industries, a broader set of people. And it also comes from being able to observe and work with a wider variety of leaders. And for someone like Scott, that's a foundation that allowed him to go be a great alumni of Monitor in a different industry, but applying those lessons. For someone like me, that variety has persisted. And so it's never, it's never gotten old. And though I've had plenty of chances to go do something else, to be honest, I've never actually thought about it because the variety has been so enriching.
That's wonderful. And Scott, for you, when you're talking to students about a career in consulting or another path, what are you hearing and how are you preparing students for this new way of business?
Well, I think a lot of students, and you can see it in the response, in many ways, consulting is an extension of business school where you continue to accelerate your perspective, your understanding of business, your ability to think critically, your ability to build teams. You are, my time in consulting, those 5-ish plus years, to Dan's point, in hindsight, and I don't think I even appreciated it in the moment, that really was 10 years of development for me, from a professional career development, skills, the ability to lead, build teams, understand clients, solve problems. It is one of the most developmental experiences. And if you find a career in consulting, great. That's Dan's path. If you don't, you've developed a set of relationships and a set of capabilities that are going to serve you no matter what path you follow. When we talk to prospective students, we're one of the largest suppliers of talent into consulting, including Deloitte and others. And when we're talking with prospective students and hearing what they're interested in, some of it is very predictable, right? They want to get exposure to different industries, different types of problems to really accelerate their development. At the same time, what we're hearing is they want to work for organizations where they can have a rewarding career with meaning and purpose. They want these opportunities for career advancement and growth. They want to work with people that they connect with. These are not new, but in professional services and consulting, organizations like Deloitte and others are beginning to differentiate themselves on how you can have a career in consulting, how you can leverage consulting for professional growth, how you can create a culture and a community where you can really connect and build relationships. And when I was in consulting in the 90s and 2000s, I would say that was less of a focus than it is today. And I think it's one of the paths that students, both undergraduate and graduate, really look to consulting as that really, in many cases, perfect first job post-business school. And that's what we're hearing from a lot of our students and why they're so interested in consulting as a path, whether it's ultimately a career or a chapter. It varies by individual.
I would say, Scott, just to build on that, there is a difference, and it's a pretty fundamental difference from when you and I started in the consulting profession today. And that is that we are much more an outcome profession than an advice profession right now. 20 years ago, this was an advice profession, and you were an advisor to an executive, giving them ideas and sage wisdom, maybe doing research for them. Now, in the world we're in, this is about how can I package together interesting data, interesting insights, interesting advice, interesting technology together to have an integrated solution to something the client is facing. And so the mindset is less, let me give you a PowerPoint and I'm going to wish you well because I've nailed your strategy. And now it's, okay, we got the strategy right and we've done it based on data and insights and infrastructure. Now let's roll up our sleeves and get this done together. And that's a big shift. And, frankly, it's led to shifts, for example, in how we're paid, because clients are much more likely to pay us for outcomes as opposed to hours billed. And I think it's a great thing for the profession, but it's a different mindset than a Renaissance consultant of the year 2000 might have had.
Yeah. Thank you both for that. And as someone who values relationship building, it's exciting to hear about how that partnership has kind of evolved over time as well with clients. So for our next poll, as we open that up, as you all know, the past 6 months have shown the immense impact that businesses can have, if they so choose, on societal issues like racial equity, community health needs, and social injustice. So we want to hear from you and what you have to say about that intersection of career and social issues that you care about. And as that poll is filling out there, would love to hear, just to start, Dan, as those come in for you, just your reflections on that kind of intersection of business and the role they play in societal issues.
So look, we set Scott was referencing North Stars earlier. We set 3 North Stars for our business. I won't go through all of them with you, but the first one is that we will be the most influential and responsible consultancy in the world. And I don't believe that the word responsibility would have entered our headline vision and our headline set of commitments to the world, 20 years ago. And the reason is a couple. First of all, like I view us, look, I lead a team of 55,000 people, some of the smartest, most talented, most diverse people in business. We have a great brand as an organization. I believe what we say and what we stand for matters, and that we can impact society fundamentally. This has been hugely important to me if I were to personalize this. And so what I think you'll find is you may be able to find your daily work with clients that advances a social issue that matters to you. So I've done a lot of public sector consulting in my career because one of the things I was so passionate about is how do we provide benefits to the less fortunate in society in a more efficient and humane way. So I spent a lot of my life consulting on those topics. So, but some people, you don't scratch that itch on your day-to-day basis, but you engage in things as a corporation or a firm on topics like climate that I referenced earlier, on topics like technology ethics and ethics in artificial intelligence, which I assume you guys are spending time on in the classroom and should be as we have to advance the thinking on there. So I view us as being able to advance and be a responsible enterprise, both in the work we do every day and then the things we take on behalf of society. And look, I recognize, and I'm sure you debate it in the classroom, as to whether the notion of stakeholder capitalism is fake or lip service or virtue signaling, or is it real? I can only tell you that from the chair I sit in, it's very real for me. It's very real for us personally. And as I talk to CEOs around the world, certainly for more than half of them, it feels very authentic and real to me. Not all of them, but more than half of them.
Yeah, thank you. And I love that with the North Star, both influential and responsible. Those are wonderful North Stars to drive towards. And how about for you, Scott, kind of taking a look at the polls, as well as just comments on that kind of intersection of social issues and business impact?
Yeah, I think, what we're seeing is what we've always seen, which is people want to work at a place where there's value congruence, there's value alignment, and people want to be a part of an influential and responsible organization. They want to make a difference. And, I look at, an institution like ours, one of the leading business schools in the world, and I see both a responsibility and an opportunity in this way. Look at our mission. Our mission is very clear: build a better world through business. And the vision that goes with that is to develop the next generation of talent that's going to go work at Deloitte or wherever they may go and leverage business and business principles to have a positive impact. Whether that is sustainability and climate, whether that's social and racial justice, whether it's access to food and safe water, whether it's economic prosperity and social mobility. Business, in my mind, has to be at the center of those conversations, working with the public sector, working with communities to help drive that change. And I feel a deep sense of responsibility to position the Ross School on the leading edge of how we use business as a force for good in society. And that's economic and that's social. And if we're developing the next generation of talent, business leaders who are inclusive, who understand how to use business in partnership with government and communities to have a positive impact, then imagine what our world will look like for the next generation and the generation after that. And what we're seeing among our prospective students and our students is they're hungry for that. There's a reason the Ross School was the first business school to have a social venture fund. There's a reason why we're one of the few business schools in the country that has an associate dean where, in this case, her only job is to get up in the morning and think about the impact that business has in society. There's a reason that our business and society speaker series last year focused on this stakeholder shareholder sort of, debate that's happening. And this year is focused on the role of race in business, because these are the conversations that are important for us to lean into and are core and essential to developing the next generation of business leaders who are going to use business to build a better world.
And I think the centerpiece of business can't be, we need to continue to emphasize it, but I will say, and, I think ecosystem was probably the most overused business word of the last 2 years, but there's something about it which the savviest business leaders actually know how to build networks in academia, in nonprofit, and in government. And they know how to pull on those networks to deal with the most intractable issues of our time. And I will tell you, as I experience the transition we're having in society, the number of business leaders who naturally think that way and then naturally can pull on a personal network that features all parts of the ecosystem, that is a rare person right now.
Yeah, and Dan, it's an extraordinary point. And what you just painted, we started a program last year called our Impact Studio. And I wish I do have a recording of you saying that now, because you are the commercial for the Impact Studio with what you just said. Because what it does is it says, all right, let's take a really, big, hairy, challenging problem in society: access to safe water, how small businesses adapt through COVID, financial inclusion and people not having access to banks. And let's bring faculty and students and business folk and government folk from different disciplines, different domains together, and weave them together in a way where you can bring these different areas of expertise to create sustainable solutions to some of these challenges and problems, at least to the scale that we can work with. And my really strong belief is our students having that experience where they're business students working with public health or social work or engineering to solve these problems. Not only we are developing students with the skills that you're looking for, but we're developing the next generation of business leaders where that is their mindset. And if we can do that, and hopefully if all business schools can do that, then the world's going to be a much better place for our kids and their kids.
Yeah, and I totally agree. And my challenge to, you, Scott, and your students and your professors is how do we as a society create more people, more of our smartest people whose careers are spent across many of those sectors. It's too hard right now. And I'd love to have, we talk all the time about, can we do more talent exchanges with the government? Can we do more talent exchanges with nonprofits, et cetera? I think we would move the needle on everything we're talking about if we found systemic ways to create more velocity of the movement of smart people across sectors.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you both for that. And I think this idea of rubbing shoulders within the ecosystem to create greater change is a perfect lead into our last question for the community here. So thinking about the future of work, how and where people work will continue to change, continue to evolve. I know for myself as a soon-to-be graduate, I'm thinking about that, especially post-pandemic. So let's talk more broadly about the future of work and what we are seeing in terms of individuals' preferences and how and where they work. Question, Dan, I'm sure your team has been thinking about quite a bit. So as that poll fills out, Scott, I'd actually like to start with you. Let's go a little bit broad, dream big with me here. What is your vision for the future of work?
Jazmyn, I appreciate it. It says that the host and panelists cannot vote, but I'd like to vote
Oh,
because
anybody want to vote?
for someone who travels a lot, and I haven't been on an airplane since March, I'm starting to go through some shakes on the non-traveling. But no, the future of work and what that means for all of us, I think is a really important set of issues that all of us need to be thinking about deeply. So let me answer it first with regards to education. So clearly we're seeing an accelerated adoption of hybrid and remote work, right? So, we've got lots of faculty, lots of staff here at the university and the business school. And so we're seeing an accelerated adoption of different work arrangements, hybrid, remote work, much of it by necessity given the pandemic, but some of it because there's a better way to deliver that particular service or fulfill that particular role in a hybrid or remote manner. At the same time, we're also seeing a strong need for human connection. We are all living in a physically distant, sometimes socially isolating world, and there is such thing as Zoom fatigue. And so there's a strong need for real human connection and experience and relationships together. And so if I were to take a big step back, as we look forward, our modes of service delivery, whether it's consulting or education, will undoubtedly change. In our case, that service is education. In Dan's case, it's consulting. How we deliver those services to our stakeholders will absolutely evolve and was already evolving prior to the pandemic. Importantly, as those modes of service delivery change, so will the workplace, right? So to the extent that service delivery becomes remote, if it's consulting, you don't have to be on client side as much. If it's in education, maybe some of it's more hybrid or remote. The workplace will need to evolve to accommodate and meet the needs of that service delivery. But it's got to go in that direction. What's the best way to meet the needs, in our case, of our students? And then how do we design a workplace to allow for that? And one of the unique things about education, if you believe like I do that residential education will always have a place on a university campus and in business schools, universities have a unique feature relative to most types of organizations, including consulting. The stakeholders who we serve, in our case, largely students, most of them, not all, but most of them are on campus because our mode of service delivery in most cases is in person. So imagine a world where Deloitte's clients weren't at their offices, they were actually in Deloitte's offices, right? And so how you would deliver that service would fundamentally change. And so to the extent that our mode of service delivery and education changes over time, so will our workplace. But it's got to go in that direction. What is our vision for the future, in our case, of education? And then how do we design a workplace where our people can thrive in collaborating and working together to deliver on our mission, in this case, academic and education? So I think there's a world of opportunity. I think we're going to see residential education come back in really robust ways, but we're going to find that much of what we've done in remote and hybrid formats creates new opportunities that most universities were not imagining. And for the universities that are not adaptive and not visionary, I fear that they have a very short future ahead.
Yeah, thank you. And then Dan, for you, just briefly, your vision of the future of work.
My vision for the future of work has choice at the center. And when I ask my team a similar polling question that you just asked, Jazmyn, the results are pretty evenly split amongst the three. And so what does that mean? In the old days, it might have meant that a leader sees that they have to therefore have a change management exercise because they have to convince everybody which the best way is. I view it differently, which is I need to configure a menu of possibilities in terms of how our people work and in terms of how we work with our clients that actually puts the person at the center as opposed to Deloitte at the center. And that change in the future of work, I believe, will be the most profound and frankly, the most liberating and the most inclusive to a future that in our profession, it supports people of all ages, of all races, people who are caregivers and not And people, as they transition to different life phases, it's no secret that there are moments in people's lives where historically the profession of consulting has been less attractive, and we see attrition rise. My view is the future of work that has choice at the center actually confronts a lot of that in systemic ways and creates lots more career possibilities for people as they travel the natural sine waves of life.
Yeah. Thank you both for that. And that's an exciting thing to envision and think about. So now we turn it over to the community, and I know we're short on time, so we're going to go rapid fire, Scott and Dan, and try to get through as many questions as we can from everyone here. So first question is for Dan from Harish, and he asks, he or she asks, how have you been able to stay connected with your coworkers and employees? And how have you managed to ensure productivity and enthusiasm? So maybe 1 or 2 tips on keeping that culture.
Very tangibly, we have been doing Friday broadcasts essentially from my house. As some of you know about me, I actually am a broadcaster on the side. I do TV stuff. I do sports commentating, mostly on soccer. And so I love broadcasting. And so we've sort of hosted our own show, and it's me in this environment talking with our people, always in a baseball hat, by the way. So I appreciate Team Michigan sending me a hat. Otherwise, I'd be wearing a Georgetown hat. And humanity is in short supply and high need right now. And so anything that any leader can do to bring humanity and empathy to the team they are leading is doing a great service.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Daniel Zand, a Ross Perspective student. Question for both of you. It's a big one. What is your key to happiness?
Dan, while you think about your answer to that question, I'll give mine, which is defining success on my terms, not someone else's.
A lot of unstructured time with my 4 kids.
I love it. Thank you both for that. The next question is in the chat from Tamaya. It says, will you provide some additional advice when thinking about the intersection of profits, ethics, and the future of work? Specifically, what do you do when an opportunity presents itself that will gain your company money, but is against your personal or moral compass? Both for Scott, as from like a donor experience lens, it says, and Dan on the influence of projects, projections, things of that nature. So whoever would like to answer first.
Well, I can start. If you're going to say, like I have, that we want to be the most responsible firm, then you better have a set of processes that allow you to do 2 things. And it's important to separate these 2 things. And the question pulls this out. You need to be able to make organizational decisions that apply your organizational values to a choice about, in us, should we serve this client or not? Should we take on this project or not? And then once you make the organizational decision, you better make it crystal clear that any individual that doesn't feel comfortable doing that work for any reason, there's no retribution, no problem with that person opting not to do that, not to do that work. And the combination of those 2 things needs to be clearly articulated. When they get blended, things can get challenging.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, similar for us, a clear statement of values and supporting our team when they make decisions that are consistent with those values, even when it's a hard decision to make, and with no questions asked. And, somebody, I think you mentioned, philanthropy or raising money, or maybe that was in the question. We're a nonprofit. We rely on philanthropy to provide student support and scholarships. And we would not be able to exist and do what we do, just like most universities, without philanthropy. I've turned down millions of dollars in proposed gifts from prospective donors because either one of two reasons. I didn't feel like we as an organization could or wanted to deliver on what was expected with that gift. So it was not consistent with who we are as an organization or where we wanted to go. Or in some cases, that gift came with, or that proposed gift came with strings that were a violation of our values. I have no problem turning down that money because, that trust and that integrity, you build it. If you start making decisions that are simply based on profit, or in my case, raising philanthropic dollars for short term, you will undermine and erode the trust in your organization and the values that you espouse to.
And Jazmyn, the only thing I'll add for people like Scott and I, you also have to recognize in the world we live in, this is a tough sport, and it's a tough sport in social media in particular. And one of the things you learn when you decide to serve certain clients, when you decide to do certain work, that not everybody's going to agree with that. And there's going to be people who poke at you and prod you and are trying to advance their own for their own cause in a sort of a mean-spirited and non-nuanced way. And I've learned to ignore, frankly, a bunch of that isn't thoughtful and is pretty mean-spirited. But that's a skill that, frankly, a lot of leaders haven't developed over time, to see criticism and, frankly, some mean, negative personal things said about you, and learning to compartmentalize that and understand where it's coming from is a really underrated skill.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think
I hope your family learned to stay off of social media.
That too. Social media breaks are lovely. And I think to your point, you both mentioned having these North Stars you drive to, which helps you kind of put those up, taking it in, but being able to compartmentalize as well. Well, to close this conversation, we've been focusing on a changing world. And my last question for you is a changing you. So thinking about yourselves as leaders and allies, where did you start? Where are you now? And where do you want to go?
Scott, I'll let you start.
Sure, that's a big question. For me, one of my North Stars is I want to be a person that helps other people realize their potential and have the life that they want to live. And you don't have to be in education to do that. You can work at Deloitte, you can be anywhere. But for me, the people that have made such a difference in my lives, Dan, you actually have one in your New York office. Cheryl Jacobson changed my life. She showed me that consultants can care. And my time with her, when working with her, was just transformative and amazing. And I want to be that person for others and build an environment where, in our case, the Ross School at the University of Michigan can be this truly transformative experience for people, where, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years later, you still look at the experiences you had on this campus as defining moments in who you are as a person and as a professional. And no matter where I'm at in my life or my career and whatnot, that's who I want to be. So that's my North Star.
I appreciate that.
It's beautiful. Here's what I'd say, Jazmyn. I am a leader in training. I am a leader in training. I will always be a leader in training. I am an imperfect leader. And if you have that mentality, you realize that there are lots and lots of ways through experience and through more formal ways, if you listen, to get better and to realize that you have a long way to go. Race is something very personal to me. I have a multiracial family. It's been a topic that is incredibly important to me for a long time. But I learned things over the last 7 months that I wish I had understood more.
Mm.
And I learned the feeling of being a parent to a Black child, and I heard the anguish and the challenge that people experience at the, teaching their children when they get their driver's license about how to behave in certain situations. And really understanding that has made me a better leader. I had one of my team members, Megan, she knows this is a passionate topic for me, and she looked at my Twitter follows, the people I follow on Twitter, and I actually like Twitter as a way to gather and curate news and information and sports and culture real quickly. And she said, "You have the whitest group of people you follow that you could ever see." And suddenly, guess what? By changing the diversity of the people I'm consuming bite-sized perspective from on a day-to-day basis, well, maybe I get a different lens on things. And maybe I'm quicker to understand that there's something really bad happening in Nigeria. And I have a bunch of people in my practice who are of East African heritage, and I can connect with them because I'm empathizing and paying attention to what's happening in Nigeria. Guess what? The average business leader in the United States has no idea what I'm talking about right now when I say what's going on in Nigeria. And we all have a long way to go. And that's the way I view myself, and that's the way I view my Deloitte organization. Imperfect leaders and imperfect organizations with a vision to try to get better and to try to be something great.
Yeah. Well, thank you both for that and for just the vulnerability that you've expressed as leaders, and these amazing tidbits from setting your own personal North Star to continuing to be a leader in training. So Scott, I hand it to you for some closing thoughts and some final remarks.
Well, Jazmyn, first and foremost, I want to thank you for moderating the conversation. You're an amazing moderator, and I look forward to following you in your career and seeing you do just amazing things, because you're an amazing student at the Ross School, and your future is very bright, and the world's better for it. So thank you very much for moderating. And Dan, to you and our Deloitte family, thank you for joining us, not only for this conversation, but for your continued support of the University of Michigan broadly, but the Ross School certainly. It's a partnership that's rich in history, continues to be an important partnership for both of us. And so, Dan, thank you from the bottom of my heart and on behalf of everybody at the school. Thank you very, very much. More generally, to all of us, all of you that are joining, I'll offer that it is conversations like this one that give me hope about the future, not only of consulting or business education, but even beyond the worlds that we live in on a daily basis, drawing hope from all of you regarding sort of our, if you will, our shared futures as human beings, as citizens, a community where all of us can come together, share perspectives, learn from each other, to Dan's point, with humility, with grace, with a commitment to continuous learning and improvement, recognizing that all of us are imperfect. But if we're striving to get better every day, really good things happen. And our world could use a lot more of that humility, that grace, that commitment to our own imperfections and getting better. So thank you all for joining. It's been a real privilege. Since Dan's alma mater, Georgetown, it at least embraces the color blue, and he's wearing a Michigan hat, I will say to all of you, as always and forever, go blue.